Now that we're able to render a list of mock data using the recycler view, we can move on to number 3 in our plan of attack, which is to implement mutation actions. The first thing we'll do is add logic on button press. The idea is that when a user taps on the add button, we want to take the content in our edit text and add it to the recycler view. The way we'll go about doing this is by adding an on-click listener on the button. What this means is that we'll be notified every time the user taps on the button, and we'll be able to take the corresponding action. So we'll do button add.set on-click listener. And as you type, you'll notice that Android Studio can actually autofill some of the method for you. So when we get inside of here, the on-click, that means that someone has actually tapped on our button. So like we mentioned, what we want to do is we want to grab the contents of whatever is inside of our edit text. The way we can do that is say etitem.getText, and this is actually going to return something called an editable, and instead of an editable, we want a string, and so we'll call toString on it. Next, we have to do two things. First, we have to add the to item to the model. And second, we need to notify the adapter that we've inserted an item. Adding an item to the model is simply a call to items, and we're adding another string. And notifying the adapter is a call on the adapter that we've defined. And the position where the item is inserted is going to be the last position in our model, which is items.size -1. And then finally, one thing we want to do is clear the edit text once we've submitted it. Let's try it out. So you can see how the item was added and we've cleared the edit text. One embellishment that we can do is give the user some feedback that they've actually added the item successfully through something called a toast. A toast is a small pop-up or dialog that shows up briefly for the user and then disappears. So the way that works is we'll say toast, and we'll call a static method makeText, and then we'll pass in the context. The way we can get the context is call this method getApplicationContext. Next, you want to pass in the actual text. So we'll say item added. And finally, you want to pass in a duration. And there's a few built-in durations, and we'll make it length short. And make sure that you call .show method so that your toast will actually show up. As you can see, there's this dialog here which says item was added. Next, let's move on to the remove logic when you press and hold on an item in our list. The idea is that if I long press on one of these items, I should be able to delete it from my list. So the way we want to do this is we want to do something similar to what we have in button add. On the particular recycler view item, we want to set an on long click listener, which is something built into Android. So the way we might think about doing that is we could say TV item dot set on long click listener. And here, what we want to do is remove the item from the recycler view. However, the difficulty is that we don't have an ability to actually talk to the adapter which is behind the recycler view at this point. What we need to do is we need to communicate that this particular item in the recycler view was clicked, and we need to communicate that back to the main activity. So it's a little bit more complicated than what we had in our button add on click listener. So we need to somehow pass information from main activity into the items adapter. The way we'll do that is by defining an interface in items adapter that the main activity will implement. Here's how it'll work. So at the top of items adapter, let's define a public interface. And we'll call it onLongClickListener. And this will have one method, which is onItemLongClicked. When we call this method onItemLongClicked, we're going to pass in one parameter, which is the position. And the reason we need to pass in position is so that the class implementing this method, which is going to be main activity, needs to know the position of where we did the long press, so it can notify the adapter that that's the position at which we should delete. We're going to now have to change the constructor of item adapter so that we can take in an onLongClickListener. So let's do that here. So we'll make a new member variable. So now that we have this variable longClickListener, we can invoke the method onItemLongClicked on this class from the onLongClickListener on the text view. So we'll do longClickListener dot onItemLongClick, and now we need to pass in the position of where this view holder is. And the way we can do that is by a method on the recycler view called getAdapterPosition. One change we'll want to make is to return true instead of false. All that means is that the callback is consuming the long click. So this comment is actually no longer completely accurate. All we're doing here is when Android notifies us that this item was long pressed, we're notifying the listener that which position was the one that was long pressed. Going back to main activity, we now need to pass in a second parameter into items adapter, which is the onClickListener. So let's do that. So let's define an instance of the items adapter onLongClickListener. And we need to override the method onItemLongClicked. So to do that, one thing we can do to help us out is we say Control O, and it'll actually tell us what are the options that we have to override methods. So we can override onItemLongClicked, and let's define this into a variable. And then this is what we'll pass in as a second parameter to our items adapter. So at this point, when we have entered into this method, we have the exact position at which the user has long pressed. So what we want to do is delete the item from the model, and then second, notify the adapter at which position it was we deleted an item. So items.removePosition is what removes it from our list of strings. So before we can reference items adapter, instead of having it as a local variable, we want to make it into a field which is accessible throughout all the methods in the class. So let's do that. And now we can say items adapter dot notify item removed. And then similarly, we can inform the user that they have removed an item. Let's try it out. So if I long press on have fun, you can see that we showed the toast, an item was removed, and it is no longer in the recycler view list of items. We've built out the functionality for adding and removing a to-do item. The last step is to implement persistence, and the way we'll do that is using the local file system. You'll notice that in the example that we have where we just removed one item, if I kill the process, if I kill the application, and I open the app again, you'll notice that all 3 items have come back. With persistence, we want to persist the changes that we've made for adding or removing a item so that when we restart the app, those same items will show up again. We'll do this with the help of a library. This is the Apache Commons library, and it makes working with files a lot easier. Apache Commons actually has a lot of functionality that can help with different features. So open up the build.gradle file, which is located in the app module, and add this line, implementation, and we want to import the Commons library. So it's commons-io, commons-io, and then we want the version 2.6. And you may want to check if you have a more recent version available, but this should be fine. Then you can tap on Sync Now. What this is doing is actually pulling in this library and downloading it so we can reference it locally and start using it locally. Let's minimize this once it's done. Now we'll add a few methods into main activity to help with the persistence. These can all be private methods because they're only going to be called within main activity.java. So the first will be getDataFile. And the idea of this method is that it will return the file in which we'll store our list of to-do items. We can call this data.txt. So this method returns the file. The first parameter of the constructor is a directory, which is we're passing in the directory of this app. And second, we'll pass in the name of the file. We're going to add 2 more methods to help with reading and writing files. The first is to read the data file. This function will load items by reading every line of our data.txt file. And then we'll have one more method, which will be for writing the file. And again, these can all be private. The first one will be called load items. And we're going to utilize the Apache Commons library here. So we're going to set items to be a new array list, which is coming from the contents of our data file. So we'll say file utils dot read lines get data file, and the second parameter is a character set. So we can just use a default character set. So what this is saying is read all the lines out of our data file and populate that into an array list, which is what we're assigning to be our list of models. And you'll notice that there's a red line here, which indicates that there's an unhandled exception. If you tap on the red light bulb, you have 2 options for how to handle this. One is you add an exception to the method signature, and second, you can surround this with the try catch. Let's go ahead and do try catch. What this means is that we'll try to execute this line of code, and if there is an exception, in this case it's an input-output exception, then we need to handle that in this catch block. So what we'll do is we'll actually utilize logging. Log.e is a way to log errors to logcat. Logs are a way for a developer to identify what's actually happening in their program. The way it works is we'll indicate a tag, and usually the convention is to use the name of the class as a tag name. And then there's a message. So we'll say error reading items. And also you can actually pass in the exception. So in our case, this is going to be E. If we do encounter an exception, instead of just leaving the items array list uninitialized, we should actually set it to be an empty array list, just so that we have something to build our recycler view off of, an empty list. Finally, we need a method to write the items to the data file. And we're again using the Apache Commons library to use file utils. And you can see that this method call might throw an exception. And so we'll do the same thing. We'll surround this with a try catch. And we'll do a similar log statement here. Error with writing items, and then we can actually print out what the error was. Now, all that's left to do is to call these methods at the appropriate times. Load items will only be called once, which is when the app starts up. We want to bootstrap our list of strings to be whatever is the contents of data.txt. Save items should be called whenever we make a change to the list of to-do items. That's in two instances. One is when we add an item, and the second is when we remove an item. So because we're only calling load items once, let's just do that first. So the place where we initialize items, instead of creating a new empty array list, let's call load items. And now we don't actually need any of the mock data here. And then for save items, we need to call this whenever we are adding or removing an item. So here, the button add is where we're adding an item. So at the very end, let's call save items. And then also when we remove an item, we should again call save items. So let's try it out. So I'm running the application, and I should, oh, it looks like we have a compile error. I think I'm just missing one parentheses. So let's try compiling it one more time. So because we removed the mock data, we now expect there to be no data. That's what we see here. But if I actually add some items, 3, now if I go back and I stop the application, you can see that it went away, and I rerun it, I expect to see those same 3 items back again. And one more test we can do is if I remove item 2, and now I stop the application, I should now see when I rerun the app, again, items 1 and 3. At this point, we've completed all of the required stories for the to-do application. We've constructed a user interface in activity main, which consists of a recycler view, an add button, and an edit text. We've implemented the model as a list of strings, and we're showing them in the recycler view. We've implemented mutation actions, in particular being able to add and remove items. And finally, we've implemented persistence using the Apache Commons library to write and read from a local data.txt file in our app.